On the 25th of April 1974, under pressure from anti-colonial forces in Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, a military coup in Lisbon overthrew the right-wing dictatorship of the Estado Novo on new state. Then, workers in cities and the countryside began to take control of factories and land in a social revolution. This is working class history.
Amigo, maior que o pensamento.
Hi, and welcome back to the Working Class History Podcast. Firstly, just a quick note that our podcast is funded entirely by you, our listeners. You too can support us and access exclusive content, like you can listen to both parts of this episode now, as well as a bonus episode, at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. Today we're going to be talking about the Portuguese Revolution in 1974-5, also known as the Carnation Revolution. As in the case of the Spanish Revolution, which we discussed in episodes 39-40, the fact that Portugal, in Western Europe and a popular destination for tourists, was a fascistic dictatorship until less than 50 years ago is not something which is talked about very much. And as with Spain, we hope that the probable reasons for this will become clear over the course of these episodes. Just to briefly give a bit of background. Portugal was a monarchy until it was overthrown in 1910 and the First Republic declared, which was highly unstable. In turn, the Republic was overthrown by a military coup in 1926, and the new regime made Antonio de Oliveira Salazar the finance minister, prime minister, in 1922. Salazar put together a new constitution, which declared Portugal to be a unitary corporatist republic. This was the Estado Novo, or new state. Corporatism is the ideology that society should be organised by corporations, which integrate both employers and employees into the state machinery, and so eliminate class struggle. Corporatism was perhaps most famously implemented in Italy by fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. Independent workers' organisation is completely anathema to corporatism, so all types of independent unions and workers' direct action, like strikes, were banned. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Salazar backed General Francisco Franco's nationalist forces, and in World War II Portugal was officially neutral, but in reality it was quietly allied with Britain, and despite it being a brutal dictatorship, Portugal was one of the co-founders of the NATO military alliance, and it freely traded with the Western European democracies. Like other Western democracies, for example Britain and France, Portugal was also violently subjugating its overseas colonies, which included Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and others. And while anti-colonial movements in most of the world eventually forced the granting of various levels of independence from European colonial powers, Portugal was hanging on as the last really old-style empire. And as we'll see, this would ultimately lead to the downfall of the regime. Phil Mailer, author of the book Portugal, The Impossible Revolution, moved to the country in the early 1970s and soon realised it wasn't like much of the rest of Western Europe.
I was just amazed at the poverty. Portugal was one of the poorest countries in Europe. It was completely underdeveloped. The whole economy, led by Salazar's type of fascism and the Estado Novo, favoured financial colonial capital and agricultural capital and not industrial capital. It was very, very backward. Trade unions were reorganized as sindicatos, fascist sindicatos, and basically were just run by the bosses. All left-wing parties were banned, including the Communist Party, and even small Maoist groups would have a little demonstration. It would never be mentioned in the papers, or if it might get two lines in the papers. And then the police would come in. The political police, the PID, would come in and break it up and arrest people and then beat them, bring them down to, they had a number of little prisons, private prisons scattered around Lisbon, and they would bring them in there and beat them up and then throw them back out again.
The PIDE, PIDE, was the International and State Defence Police. They were involved in both counterinsurgency in Portuguese colonies and in domestic repression of Portuguese workers, particularly socialists and communists, and they were renowned for their use of torture.
There was very little organization against this poverty. Just to give an example, I mean, the shanty towns were all around Lisbon. These were just like wooden huts, shacks set up on the corners of parks. And there was 150,000 people living in that kind of housing. You know, as well as that, there were very poor, small cement apartment blocks, which were very poor. But the shanty towns were just screaming out at you, and you couldn't help but seeing them. There had been uprisings. I mean, in 1934, the working class had an uprising, and this was led by the anarcho-syndicalist CGT and by the Communist Party, the Portuguese Communist Party. But it was defeated brutally, and this was a kind of forerunner to the victory of fascism in the Spanish Civil War.
In short, anarcho-syndicalism is an anarchist form of trade unionism. For complex terms like this, we're going to put some information on the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes.
After that, wages were kept at a minimum and strikes were outlawed, and the whole fascist apparatus consolidated itself. And this would last right up to the 70s. It was only in the 70s that strike movements began to grow in some of the larger companies. Like the post office had a strike which was brutally dealt with. The TAP, the airlines company, had a strike, and that was very savagely repressed. But it was only then that there began a feeling of a movement. Unions were fragmented and ineffectual, basically.
One key thing that helped change the atmosphere was Salazar himself having a stroke in 1968, after which he was removed from power by the president and replaced. He died in 1970.
And in rural areas, I mean, it was almost feudal. Rural areas in the south, there were big estates, big latifundios, as they call them. These are huge, big estates owned by one family, and they would have 50 to 100 workers working the thing and getting paid in nothing. They were given wine, they were given vegetables or some cereals. And then in the north, there was a very, very small holdings. I mean, farms of like two acres with 4 cows or something like that. It was very, very poor. The whole place was almost, I mean, I remember when I first went there, visiting the north and feeling that I was back in the 18th century. So yes, it was rural workers, urban workers, and of course women. They were regarded as chattel by both the bourgeoisie and by the working class.
For anyone who's not acquainted with Marxist terminology, the bourgeoisie is the capitalist class, i.e. employers. Raquel Varela, a labour historian and author of A People's History of the Portuguese Revolution, believes that the oppression of women in Portugal was tied up with its economic underdevelopment.
So a peasant society until the beginning of the 60s, as other peasants' modern society, women had a role much focused on domestic work or work in the field, work in the agriculture sector. Women could not, for example, vote, except in some very few exceptions. They could not even leave the country without permission of men. Men were entitled to open the letters women could receive at home legally. Of course, this all changed a lot during the 60s. There was, with the colonial revolution, women were called to the factories, and this had a huge impact even before the revolution, because Portugal has, since there, the highest feminization rate of labor, because 1.5 million people emigrated to France, Germany, and Switzerland during this period to work, because Germany, France, and Switzerland wanted cheap labor from Portugal, Spain, and Turkey in order to make competition to the organized, unionized workers of their own countries. So we had 15% of the active population went to these countries, and 150,000 a year to the colonial world. This means that Portugal in the late 60s had the biggest number of women working in a workplace in entire Europe.
Jorge Valadas grew up under the new state, working as an electrician before being conscripted into the navy.
The Portuguese political authoritarian system at that time was very specific. It was not like the Nazi regime or the fascist regime in Italy during the 40s. It was, I would say, probably a little bit less hard than the Frankism. It was a police state. It was very, very controlled. Everything was very controlled. Everything was very repressed. The political police was present everywhere in the working places and the student lives and the daily life, personal relations and everybody. There was an enormous network of political informers. I think some people had made the comparison after with the Stasi in East Germany, and it was, I think, bigger in Portugal than in East Germany with the Stasi. And so you live in this milieu. But of course, even in a milieu like that, you have a certain margin of freedom, so-called. So you could read some books, other books you could never read. You could discuss if you trust the persons and so forth.
The first rumblings, which would develop into the earthquake which would sweep away the new state, began in December 1960, when African cotton workers at a colonial plantation in Angola went on strike. In January 1961, Portuguese authorities responded by mass aerial bombing, destroying villages and killing thousands of people. This provoked a huge increase in support for pro-independence movements.
The difficulties in dealing with the underdeveloped economy could only be salvaged by increasing the exploitation in the colonies and by at home, obviously. And colonial pillage, it led to three colonial wars starting in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, and in Angola. And this became very severe.
Some commentators often describe the Portuguese Revolution as a bloodless revolution. This perspective is both Eurocentric and inaccurate.
For many years, it was told that the Portuguese Revolution started in 1974, and this is not my hypothesis over the Portuguese Revolution. What we saw is a dramatic and catastrophic combination of the contradictions of the most anachronic colonial regime. So what we saw is a peasants' anti-colonial revolution, mainly based on forced labor, which was disseminated in Portugal until 1974, although not legally after the beginning of the 60s, but in fact disseminated in Angola, Mozambique, and in Guinea, partially, much more disseminated in Angola and Mozambique. And this led to a huge support of these workers, these peasants, forced to work to the Portuguese Empire, to the state and to the companies, to being a very brave, courage supporters of the anti-liberation movements. So we cannot say that the Portuguese Revolution was a bloodless revolution, because this is focused on the idea that the revolution was in 74-75 in Lisbon and in Portugal, where 16 people died, 1/6, and this is very few if you compare to other processes of social conflicts in the history of 20th century. Very few doesn't mean that this is not important. Every death is important. I'm not making a personal evaluation of this. I'm just comparing with other process. But my main argument is that we cannot speak of a bloodless revolution, and we cannot speak of a revolution in 74-75. We have to speak of a revolution that has started in Portuguese territory in 1961, and although we don't have accurate figures for the deaths in colonial war, some military American historians, based on different variables, calculate 100,000 people died in Guinea, Angola, and Mozambique. So we are speaking of one of the most deadly process. So for the people that are listening to us, there was just one society more militarized per capita than Portugal. This was Israel during the period of the 60s. So Portugal had 10 million people, and 1,200,000 were mobilized during 13 years to the colonial war. More or less 150,000 young men each year to go to Africa to kill in the name of the empire.
Despite the outlawing of dissent, from Phil's contacts that he'd met abroad, he was able to meet up with informal groups of Portuguese radicals and hear about what was going on.
I was lucky in that I knew a group of people who were kind of left-wing but keeping quiet, so I could meet up with them, and I knew where they met and which cafes they would go to, and that, well, I became quite familiar with what was happening before the revolution. Of course, nobody knew. I mean, people said something has got to give, but I mean, we all say that, don't we? But well, it did one fine morning on the 25th of April. It did collapse, and I suppose it collapsed because it just was unsustainable. This kind of cost in people and in money was just unsustainable with the wars. Also, people were coming back from the wars traumatized because the wars got very, very bloody, and they were very savage, and there have been a lot of massacres took place, done by ordinary working class soldiers. I mean, there were conscripted soldiers. I remember getting a lift from a guy in uniform, and God, the stories he was telling of his experience of the war. He was saying this in a whisper, as though there were microphones in the car. He was afraid of even telling me. But yes, you could see the trauma that he had gone through.
Portuguese forces in the colonial war were exceedingly brutal, killing huge numbers of civilians and displacing many more. As with other colonial wars conducted by powers like Britain in Kenya or the US in Vietnam, as they're essentially fighting against the civilian population, their response is typically to try to terrorise or decimate the civilian population itself. In this endeavour, Portugal was backed by countries like apartheid South Africa and white-ruled Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. It also received extensive military aid from the US through NATO, which included things like bombs and napalm, in part to protect extensive holdings of US corporations in Angola, especially oil companies like Gulf Oil. But as pro-independence movements fought on, the death toll of Portuguese troops increased, and this went alongside the increasing unpopularity of the conflict in Portugal itself, especially as the working class population of Portugal wasn't even given a share of the plundered colonial wealth. You could maybe contrast this with the perhaps more far-sighted nature of British colonialism, whereby a share of the looted wealth began to be used to fund public services for British workers, things like the National Health Service, which quite effectively helped prevent the development of widespread anti-colonial sentiment at home. Opposition to the war also grew within the military itself, and increasing numbers of young conscripts started to desert and flee abroad, including Jorge.
I was not an explicitly political person when I was in Portugal. I was against the war. I was against the Portuguese society, against fascism, against the regime, but I had no reference, political, ideological reference. I was not connected with any political group. I just decided to desert by myself because I didn't support the situation. It was more, let's say, a sort of ethical or moral decision that I took at that time. So had nothing to do with political positions at that moment. And of course that was very difficult because I was a young guy. I had my family. I had a situation which was, my parents were from the petite bourgeoisie. My parents were a teacher in in technical school for working class, and but we lived correctly. And for me to go to the Navy was a way to improve my social conditions and my family. So, of course, when I decided to quit, that was a big break in my life, in the personal relations with my parents. That was very painful, and it was very painful for my parents. My parents suffered a lot for that, for my decision, and I took a long time in my life to reconciliate myself with them. So all these things are very complicated, but you know, I was not the only one. A lot of people did these decisions without going through political orientations.
On a practical level, deserters who are part of some underground left-wing groups could use their organisational networks to get out of the country. Other people could pay a coyote to get them across the border, as many other people did just to emigrate. But Jorge decided to try to leave the country by himself.
In my case, I tried to do it in a legal way. I asked an authorization. I had some vacation, and I was in a small boat at that time, a small Navy boat in the coast. And the commander of the boat was somebody quite open, not a Salazar, not a member of the regime, because in the Navy, in fact, the Navy was very much known as being not so much a supporter of the regime. So there was a lot of people, sort of Democrats there. So the commander of this boat was a sort of Democrat, and he understood I was against, and he understood that I was going out. But, of course, he didn't ask me, and I told him that I want to go and spend a week vacation in Spain, so he gave me an authorization. So I left, I crossed the border with this authorization. The political police didn't like it, look at me twice more than, or maybe 3 times or 4 times, but I had the official paper, so they let me go. And after in Spain, I just crossed the border to France, and that was done. But I wrote a letter to this man who gave me this document, this officer, because I didn't want to imply him. I didn't want him to have any problems with the regime. So I wrote a letter that I sent from Spain to him, telling him that I was going to desert and that he had nothing to do with that, and that I had lied to him to have this authorization. So that was the way I did, but it's very peculiar. A majority of the people, they just went to the border, paid somebody who was smuggling immigrants through the border, and they did it like that. But, well, it's a small adventure. It's much worse today when you cross the Mediterranean. So that's no reason to make a big story out of it.
In the early 1970s, a number of mostly junior military officers who opposed the war came together clandestinely and formed the MFA, Movement of the Armed Forces. They launched their coup on the 25th of April 1974 by playing a particular folk song on the radio, Grandola Vila Morena by Zeca Afonso, a popular Portuguese folk musician whose music was banned at the time.
Grandola Vila Morena, terra da fraternidade, o povo é quem mais ordena, dentro de ti a cidade, dentro de ti a cidade, o povo é quem mais ordena, terra da fraternidade, Grandola Vila Morena.
MFA troops then seized key locations throughout the country, and they were assisted by an effective mutiny of soldiers under officers who remained loyal to the government.
It was really a very small minority of the army who revolted, and in fact, a very, very small minority of the officers of the institution, military institution. In fact, the Portuguese Revolution, I think, and I defend that idea, that it's a sort of mutinery inside of the army, because what was made possible to this small group of officers to bring down the government has been the fact that there was an enormous mutinery of the soldiers, the rank and file of the army, till the last moment. Even when there was a confrontation in Lisbon between different military forces, the 25 April, there are several documents and interviews and studies done about that. Even at that moment, the majority of the army was sent against a few officers who came outside of the city to bring down the government. And they were going to smash them. They were going to make a bloodbath. But they couldn't do it because some of their own soldiers also mutinied and joined the other soldiers.
Later that day, the government surrendered to Antonio de Spinola, a former military officer and colonial governor who became a key representative of the MFA. But to those on the ground on the 25th of April itself, it wasn't clear exactly what had happened.
I was woken up early one morning by my neighbour, and she was firing her fingers in the air, and she told me that there was a revolution and I shouldn't go to work. I shouldn't even go out. Of course, I thought she was mad. And so I did. I got up and got in my car and went into town. And sure enough, there was troops all over the place. And that was the beginning of the revolution. People were just everywhere. And not only were they everywhere, they were climbing up on tanks and armored cars. Nobody knew who these people were, this group of army officers who had staged this coup. I mean, even on the day we were asking, were they from the right, were they right wing or were they left wing? Nobody really knew. And Spinola, who was the supposed leader, he was certainly not left wing. He was one of the colonial generals, was quite renowned for not so good things. But on the other hand, there were other people there who were working class. And so there was very ambiguous.
Even though there was anxiety about what the coup actually meant, jubilant people started flooding the streets. Red and white carnations were in season at the time and being sold widely by women in the streets. So people started giving them to soldiers and putting them in the barrels of their guns and on their uniforms. Some media outlets credit restaurant worker and pacifist Celeste Cairo as the first person to do this, but there's not really any historical evidence confirming this, and the practice was extremely widespread. As a result, the uprising became known as the Carnation Revolution, and symbolised by red carnations.
That first week, which I described as the first chapter in my book, I was in and out of various demonstrations and various meetings of people in the streets. After the first week, the 25th of April was the 1st of May, which is kind of Workers' Day, and would normally be banned, but was just fantastic. I mean, there were 500,000 people out in the streets of Lisbon. People with red flags, all sorts of flags, I mean, Portuguese flags. I mean, there was just everybody there. There were people from the country, had been bussed in, young people, there were old people. And I described this, I remember describing an old man who'd been probably in his 80s. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. I would never in my life forget it.
Living in Paris at the time, Jorge and his Portuguese friends heard about the revolution, and after just a few days decided to return home.
I must say that one of the first events that I will never forget was that when we took the train from Paris to Lisbon, and when we crossed the Portuguese border, well, in Spain, the Spanish police was of course very aware of what was going on, very on the observation of things, but they didn't intervene. They knew that a lot of Portuguese were coming back to the country, but they didn't intervene. And so when we got to the Portuguese border between Spain and Portugal, there was no more the political police waiting for people there. and they never, as they did before. They came in the train, they controlled people, they asked questions, eventually they arrest people. But so all these awful people had disappeared, and there was some army people in the border, young soldiers, because as you know, the Portuguese army, and that's part of that's an aspect of the Portuguese Revolution. The Portuguese army was not a professional army at that time. There are some professional corps, some professional institutions, but they were very limited. The majority was the population was dragged in the army to go to the war. So there was these young kids of the army that were in the border, and they get inside of the train, and they welcome everybody in the train. They said, "Welcome back to Portugal. Now we have freedom," and that was really very, very strong. For the train was of course full of people coming back for the revolution. So the way they greet us, it was really very strong, and in particularly when they came to where I was in my compartment. One of these young guys asked me, "You were living in France?" I said, "Yes, I was living in France. I deserted and I went to France because I didn't want to do the colonial war." And this young guy, he looked at me and he said, "You have done the right thing." And that was something I will never forget till the end of my life, because it was a sort of a reconciliation with myself. It's not always easy to leave a situation, to desert a situation, to break with your family and break with your status and, start another life somewhere. And that was really very, very strong. I don't know where he is, this guy now. I hope he's still alive. But I really want to thank him for what he told me. So that was just an event like that.
Jorge soon saw that the Portugal he returned to was very different to the one he had left.
Of course, when you have been living for 20 years, like it was my case, I was born in Lisbon, and when I left, I was 21. When we have been living there for 21 years, and when we came back in that situation, it was strange, because it was the same country and another society. It was the same society and another society, because people were just motivated and pushed by these feelings of freedom and change and fulfilling their dreams and changing their lives, and that makes the society completely different. So I discovered Lisbon in a completely different way, because Lisbon was a very, very sad city when I left. Even it's a very beautiful city, it was a very, very sad city. And when I came back, it was full of joy, and people were really having the impression they were building their own lives. So that was very, very strong. Other things were more, as I already mentioned before, other things were more difficult to understand if there was change, like what we call today gender questions. I mean, the relation between men and women, the questions of sexuality. All that was still very, very marked by the Portuguese old society, which goes back older than the Portuguese fascism. I mean, of course, it's a very traditional conservative society since it was created in the Middle Ages. I mean, it's a society that was created by the military order, and the Inquisition had an enormous importance in the formation of the country and all that. So this conservative aspect was really very, very present still, but mixed with this desire to change things. And so people were very active, were creating things, were speaking. There was the freedom of talk, and that's something very, very important. And so that was very obvious in the daily life. That was something that we you realize right away that people were changing, and they were changing their lives. And at the same time, you had the conservative authoritarian aspects of the society, which were still there.
As it became clear that the new state was really gone, years of discontent exploded, and workers started to take advantage of their newfound freedoms and assert their own interests.
The first problems in the factories and in the workplaces was what's known as saneamiento, as cleansing. In other words, getting rid of all the people of fascist elements who'd been working in the factories and had been informing on any kind of activity. They had to be got rid of. The second thing was the wages. And so lots and lots of factories were occupied by the workers, and they would make a list of demands. But there were factory struggles everywhere. The whole thing just burst into a hive of activity. I mean, there was something like 600 occupations of factories, like in the first 3 months. The other thing was renaming everything. You know, like Salazar Bridge became the 25th of April Bridge. All the street names that had fascist names or fascist dates. And some of the big struggles at that time were workers of Timex, the watch factory, an American company. They fired the bosses and took over the factory themselves.
All the strikes breaking out weren't organised by the emergent unions. They were organised by the workers themselves, who held mass assemblies to make decisions and set up bodies called workers' commissions to coordinate the struggles. Portugal was a relatively homogenous country with a predominantly white Portuguese population. But in areas with significant numbers of black workers, like construction, Cape Verdean black migrant workers participated in the struggles as well. For example, 800 builders in the Miraflores Industrial Park, half of whom were from Cape Verde, went on strike on the 14th of May demanding a minimum monthly salary of 6,000 escudos, up from just 2,600 before the revolution, as well as a maximum 8-hour, 5-day working week, 30 days paid holiday and more. They also stated their intention to spread the strike to other employers. In the countryside too, workers started to fight back against their almost feudal conditions.
The agrarian situation was a mess. Most of the land was occupied by one family, and I think it was January 1975 that the newspaper Capital had an article with a photograph of a land occupation near Beja in the south, in the Alentejo, and it was carried out by an armed group of workers. And this just was like, it was like an image from the Spanish Civil War. It just sparked occupations all over the place. And they would call in the army. The police were almost non-existent. And the real policing was done by a group called COPCON, run by Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, one of the leaders of the original coup. And COPCON were left-wing. Very often they came in and they disarmed the workers, but they handed the farm over to the workers. And this just took place all over the place. There were thousands of occupations. Then there was the Institute of Reform Agraria, Agrarian Reform, was set up. And this set out to help the rural workers in terms of managing the farms. And this was obviously only in the south. I mean, in the north, they had a very different mentality.
The north-south divide is going to be a recurring theme in this story. There were, and still are, lots of differences between northern and southern Portugal, but a key distinction here is that in the north, much of the rural population were peasants who owned small pockets of land, whereas in the south, the rural population were mostly wage workers. Related to this, the north was also a lot more conservative, and in particular, the Catholic Church had a lot of power. The Church had been a big supporter of Salazar, who had re-established Catholicism as the state religion after the institutions were separated under the Republic. As well as in workplaces, working-class people organised themselves in their communities and started trying to take control of and improve substandard housing.
It was not only the shanty towns, but there were housing problems in general. A lot of occupations of houses took place. Any empty house was occupied. Again, the government was against a lot of this, and they brought in laws trying to control it. But urban struggles were perhaps not as successful as some of the other rural struggles and the factory struggles. And the problem was there was no new housing being built at this time. And the shanty towns kept on expanding. So it was a huge, big problem.
When the revolution started, workers organized in their workers' commission, which is similar to Soviet institutions of workers' organization, but also in neighborhood commissions. So the neighborhoods, they start to be run and self-organized, not by local mayors. They had very, very few power, but by neighborhood commissions. And these neighborhood commissions, women had an essential role on this. They were very, very important on this local organization.
As in most places, like New York in the early 20th century, Glasgow in 1915, Italy in the 70s, and many others, housing struggles were organised mostly by women. And by April 1975, there'd been over 20,000 housing occupations. In parallel with struggles over economic conditions, women began to fight against their subordinate position in society more generally, although this wasn't something which their male comrades necessarily always supported. The PCP, which Phil mentions in a minute, is the Portuguese Communist Party. And also just a note that we spoke to Phil a couple of times, so this next bit of audio and some of the others later on sound a bit different, but hopefully they're still clear enough to understand.
There couldn't be any discussion about housing and urban struggles without mentioning the specific example of women. In societies where most women stay at home, they bear the brunt of bad housing and bad urbanism. An attempt was made by a group of women to set up an organization of MLM, the Movement for the Liberation of Women. And about 10 women carried posters and placards, and they met in one of the big parks in the center of Lisbon. And they put out a manifesto.
LGBTQ people in Portugal also began organising and demanding an end to discrimination. On the May Day demonstration in 1974 in Porto, the first placard demanding freedom for homosexuals was seen. And less than a fortnight later, a newly formed group, the Revolutionary Homosexual Action Movement, published a manifesto called Freedom for Sexual Minorities. It came out in the Diário de Lisboa and Diário Popular newspapers, and it demanded the legalisation of homosexuality and an end to the widespread persecution, extortion and blackmail of LGBTQ people. Newspapers and the media themselves had been drastically transformed as well by the revolutionary events.
Lisbon in particular had quite a few newspapers. There were 3 or 4 main morning papers, but then there were, in the afternoon, there was probably about 6 or 7, maybe even 8 newspapers that came out every day. All of them were taken over by the workers. And in the Diário Notícias, for example, the writer Zé Saramago, the Nobel Peace writer, took over and was part of the Workers' Committee, and he became the editor of the main morning newspaper, the Diário Notícias, which was like the official journal. That's where all the government statements and that kind of thing would be printed. In the afternoon papers, which were a little bit more sensational, of the 24 pages, probably 12 would be devoted to football. The other 12 would be really manifestos. They weren't like newspapers that we know them at all. There were manifestos, or there were interviews with workers' committees, or there were whatever was happening on the day. Some people read more than one, or they shared them around. The interesting newspaper was Republica. And Republica was really a socialist party newspaper. And this was occupied by print workers. And it became an extreme left newspaper. the Republica newspaper, plus the radio station Radio Renascença, which had been occupied by its workers, became the main left-wing mouthpieces for the revolution. And they were promoting, they were taken over by workers of a Maoist bent on the whole, but not only. There were anarchists there, and there were libertarians. The media was very, very important, and it was one of the mainstays of feeding the revolution. But mainly it was in the south, in Lisbon. In the north, it was slightly different. The newspapers were more conservative, and people didn't buy them as much. But they would listen to the radio.
In terms of the political factions mentioned just then, if you're wondering about those, we're going to give a proper rundown of them in part 2. Newspaper and radio were the most important media outlets at that time, as most people were far too poor to afford televisions.
There were TVs in the cafes, and people would go to the cafes and they would watch it in the cafes. However, TV was only, there were only 2 stations, so they were only on for part of the day. I mean, they would start at 6 o'clock in the evening, and then they would stop at 11 o'clock at night. The TV station wasn't taken over by the workers as such, but they were very much controlled by the workers. For example, there was a kind of art festival, and the theatre group, Comuna, had put on a piece which was very critical of the Catholic Church, and the government decided that they would cut off the TV. Now, the workers in the TV actually rebelled against this and turned it back on. Now, for a symbolic 10 minutes or something like that. But of all the media, probably the TV stations were the less controlled by the workers and less controlled by the left in general. The Socialist Party and the Social Democrats seemed to control the television stations more than anybody.
Phil and some of his friends were one of many groups who also decided to set up their own newspapers.
I joined a group of like-minded people who had set up a magazine, a newspaper, and it was a fortnightly newspaper at the beginning, in which we would carry out interviews with workers and just ask them what they were doing. And we would publish the interview in full, not edited, warts and all. Even if when they said things we didn't agree with, we published it anyway. And I used a lot of those interviews in the book. Another thing we did was we arranged roundtable discussions of different factories to discuss what they were doing and see if they could learn from each other. But one of the problems that came up in these discussions was the party political nature of some of the groups. And it was very difficult to distinguish or to stop. Obviously, if a person is a Maoist, they're going to have a Maoist bent on things, and they're going to see through things through certain eyes. They're also going to ally with certain people and be against others.
That paper, Combat, has been digitised and is available in full online. We'll pop a link to it in the show notes. In addition to the traditional press, workers started using other media to get across their ideas as well. One of the concepts Phil references in this next clip is the fado, a kind of Portuguese music, typically a mournful song.
There was a huge musical upsurge. Folk protest songs, that's a huge element of the way Portuguese folk music evolved, especially with the likes of Zé Mário Branco and with Zeca Afonso. Not so much the fado. The fado is a different type of music and wouldn't have been part of the revolutionary music. But the other music, the other protest music, was certainly very, very important. And the other thing was just a colourful nature of everything. I mean, the whole of Portugal was just spray painted with murals and posters, and there was like wallpaper everywhere. And it was just wonderful. You felt alive in the middle of it. Very different from advertising, or that has replaced it.
Amigo, maior que o pensamento,
That brings us to the end of part 1 of this double episode. In part 2, we take a more detailed look at the different political factions in the revolution, we look at tensions which emerged within Portuguese society and within the military, and we look at the end of the revolution and its legacy today. Relevant levels of our Patreon supporters can listen to that, as well as an additional bonus episode right now. To support our work and access exclusive content like this, learn more and sign up at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. For everyone else, part 2 will be out in the next couple of weeks. To learn more about the revolution, we highly recommend getting hold of Phil and Raquel's books. They're available in our online store, so links to both of those in the show notes, and our patrons can get 20% off those and all of our books. We've got more information, sources, photos, and transcripts of these episodes on our website, linked in the show notes. If you enjoy this podcast, please do share our episodes on social media and tell your friends about us. Theme music for these episodes is Traz Outro Amigo Também by Zeca Afonso. Links to stream and purchase that on our website. Thanks to all of our Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible. Thanks to Tyler Hill for editing these episodes, and thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.
Seja bem-vindo quem vier por bem. Seja bem-vindo quem vier por bem.